So over in the UK, journalists and politicians are losing their mind because Nigel Farage told the truth. And the truth is that the United States, the United Kingdom, and basically NATO as a whole destabilized Ukraine in the run up to the Ukraine war. And that's just a fact, as you could just look at the history of all that. And yet, just because Farage said it, they're now saying he's a Putin stooge and so on. Of course, in the bigger scheme of things here, Farage is doing very, very well in the opinion polls for the upcoming UK elections. So everyone, and that's sort of the uni party, which they have over there, just like they have it over in the United States, the uni party has decided to go after him, and this was exactly what they wanted.
It's really kind of funny, I think we both sort of woke up to that and seeing everybody in Ukraine overnight, especially kind of the UK journo bros over there, just absolutely losing their mind that, as you said, all Farage did is basically speak the truth. His statement was fairly simple, and effectively he just said, one of the major factors in this war was the West push to enhance NATO's presence in Ukraine. Well, that is factually accurate. There's nothing wrong with that statement. And I think one of the telling aspects of this is really, I haven't seen a lot of any sort of fundamental pushback on what Farage says. What I have seen a lot of is, you're a Putin puppet. And that seems to be the generalized answer. And these people are just, they've kind of just lost the way. It's sort of like that's what they have left. We've been over this a number of times. There's the U.S. involvement in Ukraine goes back to what? Probably in depth, probably 2012, culminating in the early 2014 coup that was led by Biden. And we step forward to 2021, the Biden administration, Lloyd Austin, Defense Secretary, Kamala Harris. I know there was others as well, all pushing for Ukraine's entry in NATO, which is a farcical idea on the face of it. The idea that Ukraine belongs in NATO is just ridiculous, and it doesn't take at all a genius to understand why Russia would be upset about the threat of NATO being on their very borders. We wouldn't accept that here. We've talked Biden's own CIA director warned about this. Like, what are you guys doing? This is going to be a huge problem. The other thing that maybe we'll get into a little bit later, but the other thing that drives me bananas about this, it's just an ethical dilemma, is that none of these people care about the bloodshed, the needless war, the number of deaths on both sides. I mean, Ukraine's conscripting anybody they possibly can. It's horrific, and they don't care.
Absolutely right. You're right. It did start a long time ago. I'd say it kind of started in 1990, because in 1990, just to sort of go all the way back to where all this originated from. And you and I wrote about this right when the Ukraine war started in early 2022. We wrote an article explaining all this, and I think it holds up extremely well. I just had another look at it. Everything that Farage said is in there. And it traces the whole thing back to, basically 1990, because that's when the Western NATO powers promised the dying Soviet Union, which by that point was going to split up into all these constituent countries, that there would be no expansion into those countries, no eastward expansion. And guess what happened? Despite that promise made by George H.W. Bush and James Baker,
a former
Secretary
CIA
of State,
director.
Exactly. 14 new countries joined NATO, all in the East. So 14 times they reneged on their promise. And of course, as you said, I guess Russia was able to just sort of sit by as kind of, some of these Eastern countries, the Baltics or whatever, it's not good, but okay. But then when you got to Ukraine, that was just a red line. And as you said, Biden's own CIA director said that was a red line which you just simply cannot cross. You just can't do it. And he didn't say it in whenever. He said it in a book from 2020. And yet, a year later, Biden, as you said, was over there saying, it's in your hands. You can join NATO and so on, and all these others that you mentioned. And of course, that was just that step too far. And I think the point you made is so important. It's not made often enough about what would the United States do if all that happened in Mexico. So Russia goes into Mexico. They replace the democratically elected leader of Mexico in a coup. which is exactly what happened in 2014 with the Biden-led coup in Ukraine. And then they encouraged that, well, they installed their own puppet and encouraged that puppet to take on every single anti-American policy there possibly is, especially also fighting wars against his own people who happen to be pro-American or English-speaking or whatever, which is the war in the Donbass, which has been going on since 2014 as a result of the Biden-led coup. So what would happen if that happened in Mexico? The U.S. would never, never, ever, ever allow that to happen. And Russia sees it the same way. But somehow we are supposed to ignore that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like the idea, even the leader that they installed, it wasn't like they had some shining example of democracy. The regime that they put in place was then knocked out because of just incredible corruption, I think within a year.
Yeah. Nuland, right? Nuland was on the phone call, the infamous phone call that, well, the media doesn't talk about it, but it's certainly infamous from my point of view because it was made before the coup. It was released before the coup. And in that phone call, Nuland discusses the coup. It couldn't be any more clear than that. And of course, then she says that Biden's willing, and he's okay with it. Let's go ahead. And then she mentions this guy, and you just brought it up, Yatsenyuk. He's going to be our new guy. He's going to be our new puppet. And within a year, Yatsenyuk had to go away or step down or because of corruption. So her handpicked puppet, the super duper guy who's going to fix everything, turns out to be corrupt.
And ultimately, all of this goes back. I keep trying to harp on this point, and it's another point that I just don't think can be made enough, is that all of this stems back to the Russia collusion hoax. I just don't think people fully appreciate or maybe think often enough about the fact that whole narrative fundamentally altered our approach to foreign policy as a nation. This was just a political scam, a political hoax by the Clinton campaign that morphed its way into our entire culture, and then more than that, into our official foreign policy and the way that we would approach, every nation. I mean, we're talking about superpowers. It altered how we approach Russia. It altered how we did with China. For a while, we weren't even thinking about China. We were just thinking about Russia. So it altered our entire foreign policy and carries over now into a war that we pushed on Ukraine. And for all these UK people that are up in arms, you know what I noticed today that none of them are doing? None of them were mentioning that was Boris Johnson who actually went when there was a possible peace settlement to the Ukraine war, and it was Boris Johnson who went in and said no and killed that deal. It just disgusts me that the lives of so many people, we're talking hundreds of thousands, not a small number, are just nothing to these people. It's irrelevant. They don't care. It's all a political game.
And it continues to be. So now they're instrumentalizing their own lies to go after Nigel Farage because Nigel Farage is a threat to the system. And
right. That's why they're so in uproar against Nigel. They wouldn't care if he was nobody. Exactly.
Exactly. And the system, of course, is exactly like in the U.S. is a two-party system, first past the post, which means that it's almost impossible for a third party to penetrate ever, which has not happened in the UK or very, very little, and obviously not in the US either. So there's a lot of parallels there. And what those systems have produced in both countries is this uniparty. That's sort of the essence of it. Now, within the Republicans, of course, Trump has kind of upset the apple cart a bit and kind of disrupted the uniparty to an extent, and certainly back, when he was president, and he might do again. But that doesn't mean that in its core, the GOP is still part of the uniparty. And in the UK, you mentioned Johnson. Johnson was meant to have been their Trump, but then he just turned out to be a total uniparty guy. He demonstrated that over and over, but none more so than in Ukraine. He was the biggest cheerleader of the war, and I think he still is, of any Western leader. I mean, I think he even outdid Biden on that front.
Yeah. One other thing that we haven't mentioned in all of this is NATO itself. And the very idea, you talk back to the origins of going back to 1980, and then as we move forward on that agreement and all the developments into the 1990s, is the whole premise for NATO went away. And, in a perfect world, of course, power never gives up power, but we would have left, NATO would have ended. The need for it had morphed to the point that it wasn't required, and we should have gotten out of it. And that's another convenient aspect about the Russiagate narrative, because, of course, Trump was talking about ending NATO. He recognized that there's no particular need for it. And, that power structure doesn't want to give those kind of things up. Think about the industrial military complex. They probably were apoplectic over the idea of us getting out of NATO for all the weapons that are shipped there and the aid that's given. So there's that other dynamic at play as well. But at least from my own perspective, I don't see a reason for us, and haven't seen a reason for us, to be in NATO. But they can propagate it now because they've demonized Russia all over again.
And that's probably one of the reasons why they demonized
Yes,
Russia all over again.
that's what I was trying to allude to.
Right, they just needed to go back to square one in a way, Cold War or Cold War 2.0, because then they can justify having NATO again. And obviously now, because there is a war, there's no way that Trump can come in and dissolve NATO or get out of NATO. It's just not going to happen. It's simply, even if he wanted to, that's simply not going to happen. Whereas, a few years ago, say, if there hadn't been a Russia collusion hoax, if none of these things had happened, maybe there would have been a chance of doing something, or at least realigning NATO to its original idea, which is to protect the countries of Western Europe in order to protect the United States. Hence, it's called North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, North Atlantic. That's a very specific geographic area. So, yeah, no, I completely agree. And just to illustrate, your point in a very in a way that it just goes to show how deeply entrenched these elites still are, and how bad things still are, and I mean, it's one of these marches of thousands of steps, but we've done like maybe 2 or 3 steps. I mean, that's how far we've gone in terms of the elites and deep state, whatever you want to call it. And that's the appointment of the new NATO General Secretary. So all of these international organizations, and they're always manned with people from the elites, the Bilderbergs, or whatever you want to call them, and usually not only undemocratic, no one elects that guy, but anti-democratic, and it's happened here as well. So the new leader of NATO is this guy called Mark Rutte. He used to be the prime minister of Holland, but he just lost an election. Hence, he gets a new post. That's what elites do, right? They kind of do the merry-go-round where they can just switch places and get these new nice appointments. And we haven't and hence that's why it's anti-democratic. So in order to get one of these, by the way, it's the same with the EU and their leader Ursula von der Leyen and all these people, these commissioners and so on. Usually they end up there because they lost an election. So that's not only undemocratic, that's anti-democratic. You literally send the losers to be the new heads of these places. And so that's happening with NATO right now. And I think what that illustrates is that we're just really, really not far along on the way of trying to fix these institutions and just kind of basically fix Western civilizations, which has become so corrupt and is run by this core of elites, and they just play this merry-go-round game, and we're just stuck in it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because the EU, I think a lot of people don't realize, there's always kind of this delicate balance between power consolidated in the hands of the very few and a massive runaway federal government that controls everything on the other end of things. Both are sort of dictatorial in their own ways. And the EU is actually tiny in terms of its governmental structure out of Brussels. And like you said, these are unelected leaders, which, by the way, I guess now so is Zelensky. He's declared martial law and he's suspended elections, and so much for a democracy. He's entrenched himself. He's an oligarch. Actually, I guess I can't prove it, but I view him more as a quasi-oligarch, a guy who's gotten very wealthy, who's controlled by oligarchs.
Well, he's controlled by Igor Kolomoisky, and this is a story.
Yeah, I think it's probably broadened away from Koiminsky at this point, though.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, and let's do another show on Kolomoisky sometime.
Because we could talk about that another time.
It's sort of the untold story of all this, and I don't want to get ahead too far, but it involves Biden, and it involves basically Biden protecting the oligarch who's protecting the corrupt oligarch who stole all the IMF money. In order to protect Zelensky. They have the Euro 2024 soccer championships on right now, and Ukraine played there the other day. They actually won a game, and that's fine. I'm happy for them and all that. But there was a banner, or several banners, giant banners from Ukrainian supporters You know what they said? We want elections. So, uh,
Well, I mean,
I
we
don't
see
want to say the
videos every
tide is
day of men
turning or
being
whatever, but
conscripted off the streets, right? It's that's where we're at. They are
just
out of
tiny.
people, and it's horrific. And the last thing that we have in Ukraine is a democracy. What we have is what we've always had in Ukraine, a number of corrupt oligarchs who are controlling everything. And Congress loves to interface with that for that very reason. They don't care about Ukraine. No
No, no,
Congress
exactly.
member
This is just
fundamentally cares about Ukraine, but they sure do love the way that it can be used given the power structure of, a small handful of Ukrainian oligarchs that are willing to deal with them.
right now. They don't care. They care about the geopolitical aspects and by extension, military industrial and that kind of stuff. They don't care about Ukrainians. Now, of course, it was great to see those banners about we want just from ordinary Ukrainian people at a football game or soccer game. Like, yeah, we want elections. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, this is the tide is turning or whatever. These are very small incremental steps, just as they are with generally, exposing the elites and all their games. But I think the fundamental problem as to why the tide, I can't really say the tide is turning or not properly yet, is because the media suppresses all these things, and the media does still have quite a lot of influence, unfortunately, in setting the narrative. How many people? I mean, what's your guess? I mean, how many people would know about the fact that Zelensky has exceeded his term and he's canceled elections? I mean, how many people in the West know that?
Very few.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do kind of with frequency and by intent is wade into on X, on Twitter, is wade into the leftist side of things and post underneath, what are rabidly leftist, progressive, large accounts, be it politicians or others. And one of the reasons that I do that is, first of all, because so many of these people never see an alternate voice, although now they're seeing a lot more, and that's a good thing. But also to get a sense of kind of what that view is. And it's so often I'm just taken aback. And it's good to pinch myself and remember that so many people are still fooled by the media and by the narratives and just know what they know. And, it's easy to mock, etc. And believe me, I do my share of that. But it is also worth, remembering that for a lot of these people, it's not truly their fault. There's the rabid progressive left, and it is their fault. They're fomenting this. But there's a lot of kind of average citizens who are sort of well-meaning who believe they're doing the right thing. It's like we watch the news, I'm kind of informed, and, why wouldn't, if that's all the headlines you see, why wouldn't you think that's a good thing? And they just, it comes back to this element. If we had an honest, open media, the world would be an incredibly different place, which is why we don't have an honest, open media.
Sadly, that's true. You see it with COVID origins as well. I think there's a lot of people. Every time there's a big breakthrough in terms of, for instance, these. I don't mean to digress too much here, but in terms of these Senate hearings this past week and so on, you do see a lot of people on Twitter and so on who, on the left, or who were like, "Well, I just believe what the media said," and they're like, "Whoa, I didn't know that. I didn't know that Fauci funded this. I didn't know that. All this kind of stuff." So. But it's such a slow incremental process. And I think what not you and I, but generally people sort of on Twitter or X kind of underestimate is because once you've built your little, what we call the corner, right? A corner on Twitter where we know there's good information and people who get it. And so that's where you would have read 4 years ago that COVID came out of a lab. That's where you would have read many years ago that Joe Biden green-lighted the coup in Ukraine, and it was a coup. And anything, Russia Gate, whatever, all the information is there. But I think there's a temptation of people within the corner to sort of get carried away to think, well, all the information is here. That's the truth. We know it's the truth. There's always checks out because every time a prediction is made or something is said, and later on it turns out to be exactly right. Great track record, everything. And then there's that temptation to think, well, we've broken through the media, the wall that they built, and the misinformation and the lies they tell us. And unfortunately, it's just so tiny. It's so incremental because, as you say, most people random people that you meet somewhere or whatever don't know. They're not in the corner on Twitter, and they don't know all these things.
I do think there is if I'm being honest, though, I also think that there is a very real shift that's taking place. But what that runs up against is people's own personal belief systems. If you've built up this belief system for the last X number of years that Russia's evil, that the war in Ukraine is being done for, righteous purposes, for the power of good. It's very difficult then to suddenly reverse that and realize that you've been lied to the whole time. It's very difficult to almost deify Anthony Fauci as the savior of COVID, and that everything he told you, he was on the up and open, and thank God if we didn't have him, to go from that to realizing that everything he told you was a lie, and he's a pathological liar whose problems probably, but not probably, I know they go back, decades. But that's a very difficult thing to surmount. However, the flip side of that is once you do surmount that broken faith, that's irretrievable. You'll never get that back. So as more and more people open their eyes, the problem is, when does that happen? It's it's a difficult thing. There's one thing I maybe wanted to shift gears here, but we were mentioning the fact that U.S. politicians don't care about Ukraine, but they're happy to use Ukraine. And that element came out in new documents that were released by John Solomon. And by the way, it pisses me off no end that Solomon only has access to these documents. For people who don't know, these documents are coming from Devin Archer. So James Cormac Comer told us that after Archer's testimony and everything, he'd agreed to turn over a huge number of documents, 3.7 million, I believe it was. And most of them had never before been seen. And after Comer had a chance to go through some of them, he was almost giddy on Bartiromo, basically saying, oh my God, this is just the mother lode. It's going to help break things open. And we're finally starting to see a few of these documents come out. And one of them is a proposal from Boy Schiller. And Boy Schiller is Hunter's law firm. And it was a proposal that they issued in 2014 at the behest of Hunter on Ukraine. And the whole proposal is fomented about getting U.S. politicians on board to support their efforts to promote Burisma and its corrupt owner, Mykola or Nikolai, he goes by both names, Zlochevsky. That's one of the great problems you and I have run up against with these Ukrainian names. They all have like 5 names. But this effort to promote them, and one senator in particular came up, and we'll come back to this, is Chris Murphy. But it was very clear, these politicians, there's a few groups they were working with Ukraine because there was a lot of money flowing around. And so now we have these new documents that show this interaction and this effort to create an echo chamber to promote Burisma all the way back in June of 2014.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really good point. I mean, we talked earlier about the geopolitical aspects, even the military-industrial aspects of Russia as this evil empire, and all these fake narratives that are put out in order to stir up Cold War 2.0, and of course now Cold War 2.0 is sort of a hot war in at least in parts now. But in parallel, as you quite rightly say, there is something else going on, which is the personal enrichment. I guess there's some overlap with military industrial and so on, but I think it's much more specific. It's it's on a much sort of more micro level. That's not to say that there isn't a lot of money involved, but it's micro in comparison to the sort of geopolitical view of why these conflicts are being stoked. That is something that the Biden family has always abused and always made use of. They go into these places where Joe Biden is appointed, in Ukraine he was appointed as the point man, as the czar of Ukraine by Obama. And shortly after that happened, a few weeks later, Hunter shows up in order to cash in. And of course, it's perfect for the narrative. It's not just that that Joe Biden has some leverage because he's now the czar, but it's the fact that they have this perfect smokescreen, they have this perfect excuse, which is Ukraine is corrupt and now Joe Biden is going in to clean it up. And then they always rub that in. They always say, oh, well, Joe Biden was just trying to clean it up. He was trying to fix the system and whatever. And that is then used as some kind of excuse or just a smokescreen for any of these other activities done by Hunter on behalf of the Biden family. And of course, you see that with Fauci as well. Again, I know we keep kind of digressing to Fauci, but it's really important, I think, because he was just trying to save lives. Did you see Lawrence O'Donnell? Oh, he saved millions of lives. He's a hero, whatever. That's always put out
you're talking about the tweet where Lawrence O'Donnell utterly obliterated any credibility that he might have had left.
Right,
fawning,
exactly,
disgusting tweet. I think both of us, I know I did, mocked the hell out of it. He got destroyed for that, basically. Thank God.
but that's their game. That, oh, Fauci is the savior. He saved all these lives, and then that's kind of used as the, I don't know, just to smother all the detailed discussions about what he actually did. So in Ukraine, the detailed excuse, well, not the detail is that Hunter went in there, and we can talk about the other email here in a moment. We should do, but Hunter
That's
went
a more
in there to
important email in
basically
some
cash
sense,
in
but
on the fact that his father was the czar, or the whatever you want to call it, viceroy. I think viceroy was the word I used, which I thought was quite kind of. Viceroys, the British went and sort of colonized places, and then they sent viceroys as the leaders, because it's not quite like the president or the whatever. It's not the prime minister, whatever. It's sort of something below that, but de facto leader. So Joe Biden became the viceroy of Ukraine, and the excuse used, if anyone asked about what Hunter was doing, is like, oh, you can't ask about that because Joe Biden is trying to clean up that place. So that is sort of the same thing that they did with Fauci as well, when anyone asked any questions. So there was the Boyce Schiller, which is Hunter's law firm. I thought that document was extremely, interesting. Obviously, it's a memo written by a law firm, so it's not going to say, oh, we're going to launder money. You're not going to find those words in there. But nonetheless, it said in 2014 that they would have a political strategy of protecting the Burisma and its owner, Zlochevsky. And that's in there. And as you said, they roped in this guy, Murphy, the senator. And I thought that, hasn't received nearly as much attention as it should have.
Yeah, I sent something out targeting Murphy with quotes from that, and it actually did very well. But I just want to read something here because I have the proposal open in front of me. So bear in mind, this is June 2014. I think it's June 20th, something like that. And Biden has now been he's in charge of the foreign relations with Ukraine now for not quite 6 months, for close to it though, for certainly 4 months by now. And here's what they say. Our overall strategy is to meet with the U.S. officials in Washington, D.C., who are leading U.S. policy related to Ukraine, to brief them on who Burisma is, its significance to the future of Ukraine, and the investigation in order to seek their advice and assistance, focus on why a legal challenge and/or a taking of Burisma's licenses is detrimental to both U.S. and Ukrainian national interests. Now, there's a couple of things I want to make point before I turn it back to you, is the idea that the U.S. officials who were involved in foreign policy in Ukraine, they all knew exactly who Burisma was. They all knew exactly who Mykola Zlochevsky was. The licenses that are being referred to in this quick statement, those are the licenses that Mykola Zlochevsky stole when he was the minister of resources. I forget his exact title. Those are the licenses that he stole, transferred to his company Burisma, that made him a multi-billionaire. Now, just real quick, so with that strategy as the backdrop, they then go on to target the people that they want to get to. Chairman Robert Menendez, Ranking Member Bob Corker, Ben Cardin, these are all senators, Senator Ed Markey, Chairman Chris Murphy met with staff. There's more on Murphy. Ranking Member Ron Johnson, Democrat, not the Ron Johnson that people think of today. Senator Ben Cardin, Kelly Ayotte, Rob Portman, etc. So these are all the people that they targeted with and then held meetings with. And everybody that they were talking to knew exactly what Burisma was, yet they effectively set up an echo chamber to promote and protect and make Burisma sound like a great thing, as Hunter Biden was engaging in his illicit activities. It's disgusting.
Right, and that strategy, talk about a conflict of interest. They talk about protecting Burisma is in the national interest of the United States. Okay, that's the argument that was put forward by Hunter's law firm, Boyce Schiller, in that document. So who determines the national interests of the United States and national security interests of the United States? Well, in this case, the viceroy of Ukraine, who was Joe Biden. So Joe Biden is implementing or deciding on a policy, on which course to take on a policy, which if he implements it is going to help his son and his son's stated goal of protecting Burisma. This is completely wrong on every level. And yet, we have it there. It's on paper, and no one questions it. Now, one of the pushbacks I've heard in the past is, Joe Biden wasn't really the leader of Ukraine, he was viceroy, whatever you want to call him, the czar, whatever word you want to use. Well, if you look at this is much broader, and this is not necessarily corrupt, but it just goes to show the level of influence and the micromanaging. If you look at some of the stuff that Biden forced them to do, other than everyone knows about firing the prosecutor. Well, that's massive micromanaging, which of course was entirely done to help his son and help Burisma. But it happened on so many other levels. There's so many other examples. So, for instance, Joe Biden told the Ukrainians that they needed to adopt an inspector general system, which of course is the system that runs in DC. Not very well, mind you, as we found out during Russiagate. Who's he to say that? By the way, other countries don't really have that system. Inspector general system is a very, very US-centered thing. So who's to say that some Eastern European country needs that system? Well, Joe Biden decreed it, and he told them to do it. And many, many other things about how they're supposed to organize their various administrative units. And of course, there was a lot of things about how the prosecutor's office is supposed to be organized and whom to hire. They told whom to hire, not only whom to fire. I mean, there's tons and tons of examples of Joe Biden directly micromanaging how Ukraine is run. And I think the answer to these people who say, oh, well, he was just like, the Ukraine is an independent country and it had its own, sovereignty and so on. Well, the answer to the fact that that's wrong lies in the fact that every single time when Joe Biden told them to do something, they did do it.
And it was almost always self-serving. One of the things Biden created, NABU, which was the Anti-Corruption Division, which effectively was an opposing arm to the prosecutor's office. And NABU, it sounds great. You have this National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Sounds wonderful, nice name and everything. And really all that they did is they served to stymie what the prosecutor was actually doing. And that was where the allegations of money laundering for Latvia, that Latvia said Hunter and Archer are engaging in money laundering at Burisma, went to NABU. NABU stifled that. NABU's the same entity that disclosed the fictitious black book on Manafort that led to Manafort getting knocked out of the campaign, et cetera, et cetera. So NABU was, and by the way, the FBI was working there with NABU integrally. So that was the body that Joe Biden set up.
It was, and then we got George Kent as well here. He was the charge d'affaires over at the embassy in Kiev. Charge d'affaires basically means guy in charge of everything, and so he wrote a letter to the prosecutor telling them whom to leave alone because there was some NGOs, who were kind of siphoning off stuff from all this money pouring in, for instance, with this so-called anti-corruption effort, which, as you say, is they're simply creating a new power base to push their own stuff. It's got nothing to do with corruption or whatever. It's just like messing things up over there, self-serving, as you say. So the Ukrainian prosecutors were actually looking into some of these groups that were taking some of that money for themselves. And then George Kent, the charge d'affaires, told them to cut it out. Again, if that's not running another country, what is? And they did cut it out.
Well, and George Kent's the same guy who knew that the first prosecutor that was going after Burisma in 2014, he knew that prosecutor paid a $7 million bribe, or was paid a $7 million bribe by Maurice Burisma to end that investigation. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. There was an investigation that was effectively being led by the UK. It's kind of a complicated story. But when they went to get a letter affirming the investigation into Burisma that would allow the UK prosecutors to go forward, his office, basically, Vitaly Yaremo is his name, he refused to provide it and said, there is no investigation, we closed it. And it forced UK to abandon everything. And that was how Burisma got out of the first investigation. So they actually ultimately didn't need the Bidens for the first investigation, even though they were utilizing them. They figured it was just simple to pay a big bribe to end that. And then we moved that's when Shokin came into the picture, and he was much more serious. And because of the fact that he was conducting such a serious investigation, including an investigation into Hunter and Archer, that's what necessitated Joe Biden, which now that leads us into maybe the final aspect of today's show, which is really kind of that blockbuster single email from Devon Archer on October 20th. So why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, no, we mentioned that earlier, and I'm glad you sort of brought us back to that. Um, it really is because the Democrat narrative, if you look at Goldman and people like that, they've always been putting out this lie that either the prosecutor who took the 7 million was Shokin, which as you just explained, that wasn't him; it was his predecessor. Shokin came in to clean up that guy's mess. But the lie that they always put out is that Joe Biden fired the prosecutor because he would not investigate Burisma. They twisted it. They completely turned it on its head. You could just go back to Goldman's tweets and so on. That's sort of what the narrative that they put out in the media, of course, always parroted that narrative. Well, the media still parrots that narrative. The media has not come out to say that, oops, sorry, we got that wrong. We shouldn't have said what Goldman said because that's a lie. And in fact, it's the exact opposite that's true. Well, they haven't done that, but they should do that because, as you say, this week we got an email, October 20th, 2015, it's from Devin Archer. So we talked about him already, Hunter's business partner there, and he puts in a quote. I think the fact that this email has a quote makes it so powerful. From the chairman of the board and the chief financial officer of Burisma, a guy called Vadim Pojarski. And the quote is a wish list of things that they want Hunter to do. After all, they're paying Hunter a lot of money, so Hunter needs to deliver. And the quote says, U.S. officials have to basically bail out this guy, Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma. They have to tell Ukrainian authorities to cut it out. They specifically mention the prosecutor general. That guy has to cut it out. That's in there. And they mentioned that the ambassador at the time is a guy called Jeffrey Pyatt over there in the Ukraine. And he has to go and say nice things about Zlochevsky and Burisma. So that was kind of the wish list. And even Archer thought that that's a bit over the top in terms of how it's worded. But obviously, they then went and did exactly what the wish list said. And that was to get rid of the prosecutor, which Joe Biden then did a few weeks after that. So we kind of knew the general outline of the story, but I always thought, always means that for this kind of past week or so, that this email really puts it all into focus. It's so crass, it's so extreme in its language in terms of what was being demanded. And if nothing else, coming back to my initial point here, if nothing else, that email proves once and for all, for Dan Goldman and all these other Democrats and all the media and whatever, that no, Joe Biden did not fire the prosecutor in order to get Burisma investigated, because that email proves it was the exact opposite.
Yeah, and the email is important for a number of reasons, right? First of all, one of the things that they're asking for in addition to the prosecutor is the involvement of high-level U.S. officials. And it stemmed from Pyatt's speech, where Pyatt did two different, really kind of opposing things. One, he attacked the existing prosecutor, Shokin, conflated him with Vitaly Yarema, but at the same time, he also attacked Mykola Zlochevsky for being corrupt. And that's what then led to this email being sent. Because, of course, Zlochevsky freaked out and directed Vadim Pojarski. Pojarski's kind of a strange, he's technically the I think he still is, the CFO of Burisma, but he's also like Zlochevsky's closest advisor, so he wears a number of hats. And, he sends this directive, but what's so important about this is it places the email that we did have, which is blockbuster in its own right, the November 2nd email from Vadim Pojarski. We didn't have this prior email to kind of give the sequence. So that November 2nd email asks that basically it comes out and it sort of hints that the plan that we've been working on isn't working and you guys need to do more. And of course, right after that was sent, Joe Biden comes in. And you and I have long suspected that wasn't, it was kind of viewed as that was the first directive from Pojarski. And we'd always thought, no, it's not. That's him coming back and saying everything you guys are doing isn't enough. So it's pretty clear now what happened. They went back and they were formulating kind of a response and a public relations campaign with Burisma, et cetera. And this October 20th, this new email hits where what Pojarski is saying is you guys aren't doing enough. We need to get high-level officials, et cetera. In this same email, Devin makes clear that he says, I think this might be a little too overt, but this was the feedback. So they obviously went back to Pojarski with something that was sort of a modified version of that, because they didn't, they just thought it was too over the top. Pojarski comes back on November 2nd and says, no, everything that you're doing isn't enough. We need high-level involvement of U.S. officials. I already told you this. We also need to get pressure on the prosecutor, and the ultimate goal is ending the investigation into Mykola Zlochevsky. So now we've got this sequence of events, and it ties everything together. We did a Substack article on this, and I know some people were saying, oh, this is old information. And in a sense it is, but this email is very new, and it really changes the structure and the counter arguments from the left. This kind of blows it out of the water. It's now obvious what happened.
Absolutely. And so we, as you say, we now have the sequence. So there was this sort of buildup of pressure for Hunter to finally do something. Now, I guess often in these countries where he went, he just kind of took the money and he just kind of disappeared. But this guy, Pozharskyi, was like, no, we pay you a lot of money. You're going to have to do this now. And so now we kind of, it's not, I don't think the October 20th email is the starting point, but it's certainly the starting point of things getting very explicit. You guys need to do this now. And then he puts it, but this is via Devon Archer. And then, of course, as you mentioned, on November 2nd is where Pozharskyi says it himself. The deliverables, these are deliverables. This is what we agreed on. This is what you guys need to do. And then within 20 days, Joe Biden changes U.S. policy, which is another thing. I don't want to rehash all this again, but we have all the documents that U.S. policy was to issue the loan guarantee. All the criteria had been met. Everything was fine. The so-called interagency, of course, that's another topic in and of itself, but they always accused Trump of going against the interagency. Well, the interagency said release the money. Everyone was fine. And then Joe Biden, and only him, it was his personal wish. It's not the interagency, it's not a U.S. government agency, U.S. government department, U.S. government policy, none of those things. Joe Biden personally changed that policy in November of 2015, right after these emails.
Yeah, that's something that's not often talked about, is that the official DOJ policy was to go ahead and give the money to Ukraine.
Right.
It was a reversal by Biden. But I want to go to something on this November 2nd email. So bear in mind, we have the new October 20th email with these kind of generalized objectives. And we know there was something in between, a feedback where Hunter and Archer went back to Pozharskyi. And the responding November 2nd email, it opens with, "Thank you for the docs provided. I have analyzed them most carefully and came up with the following observations. The first thing is that the suggested scope of work is largely lacking concrete, tangible results that we set out to achieve in the first place." So it's very clear what's being said. And that's where he lays things out and says, you got to produce deliverables. And then, as you said, we skip forward and suddenly Joe Biden is out there. And we know, we have proof that Joe Biden had it as a directive to go ahead and remove the prosecutor, because we have a November 22nd itinerary that was produced. And in that itinerary, they said that reforms must include an overhaul of the Prosecutor General's office, including removal of Prosecutor General Shokin, who is widely regarded as an obstacle to fighting corruption, if not the source of the problem. Well, that, first of all, that's obvious that Joe Biden jumped on and did what he was, directed to do. But you can't view that statement in isolation, because just a short 4 months earlier, the administration, Victoria Nuland herself, had a letter hand-delivered by Jeffrey Pyatt to Victor Shokin, thanking him for all the work he had done in fighting corruption and the fact that he had made huge strides. So 4 months later, suddenly after they're directed by the CFO of Burisma, Zolchevsky's right-hand guy, to bring in Biden, suddenly Biden is claiming that Shokin is this guy that's the fundamental problem of corruption, when 4 months earlier they delivered him a presidential letter, the kind of thing you hang up on your wall, for doing a fantastic job of fighting against corruption.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Maybe we can close it out here by kind of closing the circle, coming back to where we started off from, which of course was that Nigel Farage just pointed out all these things on a very broad scale, namely that the Western countries, NATO in particular, had been meddling in Ukraine, and of course that's going to upset Russia. And I think that's on a micro scale, the whole thing we just discussed with Biden corruption and so on. Now that in itself isn't going to trigger a war, but what the hell's going on? I mean, the U.S. vice president is over in another country. I mean, imagine the vice president of Russia, Medvedev, or prime minister, is over in Mexico, extorting people and using leverage from the Russian government to do things over there. U.S. is not going to be happy about that, but that's just kind of on the micro level. But on the broader level, of course, this ties in with the other things we mentioned: the geopolitical shaping, the military-industrial complex, the justification for NATO to exist, and so on. If you look at all these things in totality, what emerges is massive meddling in a country far, far, far away for very self-serving purposes. And so I think it is absolutely legitimate to say that, yes, of course, Putin started the war. That's not good. You have to blame him for that. No question about that. But in terms of being nonstop provoked over years and years and years, that's just a fact.
Well, I guess maybe we can kind of close with this, that Farage is being attacked and demonized because he did one thing. He told the truth. And every time you tell the truth, that's something that the leftists can't handle, and kind of the global elite, the establishment. That's what they fear, is the truth. And that's all he did, is he told the truth, and he said it factually, and, that's provoking a systemic response.